Let's start this section by a discussion of variables, which are one of the most fundamental concepts in JavaScript and any other programming languages. In programming, we use a variable to store data temporarily in a computer's memory. So we store our data somewhere and give that memory location a name. And with this name, we can read the data at the given location in the future. Here's a metaphor. Think of the boxes you use to organize your stuff. You put your stuff in various boxes and put a label on each box. With this, you can easily find your stuff, right? A variable is like a box. What we put inside the box is the value that we assign to a variable, that's the data, and the label that we put on the box is the name of our variable. Now let's see this in code. So here in index.js, I'm going to declare a variable. Now previously, in the old days, before ES6, we use the var keyword to declare a variable. But there are issues with var, as you will find out later in the course. So going forward from ES6, the best practice is to use the let keyword to declare a variable. Now we need to give this variable a name or an identifier, and this is like the label we put on a box. So I'm going to call this name, and finally we need to terminate this declaration with a semicolon. Now let's log this on the console and see what we get. So console.log name. Once again, we need to terminate this statement with a semicolon. Save the changes, and here in the console we see undefined. So by default, variables that we define in JavaScript, their value is undefined. Now we can optionally initialize this variable. So I'm going to set this to a string, which is a sequence of characters, like mosh. Note that I'm using single quotes. You can also use double quotes. Different developers have different preferences, but it's more common to use single quotes for declaring strings in JavaScript. Now, when we save the changes, instead of undefined, we see mosh on the console. So here in this example, we have declared a variable called name, and we have set that to this value, to this string. Now, we have a few rules for naming these variables. Here are the rules. First is that they cannot be a reserved keyword. So in JavaScript, we have reserved keywords. Let is one of them. You also have if, else, var, and so on. Now, you don't have to memorize this list. If you try to use one of these names, you're going to get an error. For example, if I change this to if, note this red underline. This is indicating that this is not a valid identifier, okay? So revert it back. Now, the second rule is that they should be meaningful. We want to have meaningful names, like meaningful labels. I've seen developers using names like A or B or A1 or I don't know, X. These variable names do not give us any clue what is the purpose of these variables. What kind of data are we storing at that memory location? So always use meaningful and descriptive names, okay? Now, back to name. The third rule is that they cannot start with a number. So we cannot have a variable like one name. But again, going back to the second rule, why would you want to call a variable one name? It's meaningless, right? So always use meaningful names. The fourth rule is that they cannot contain a space or hyphen. So if you have multiple words, you need to put them together. Here's an example. Let's imagine we want to declare a variable called first name. So first name, and note that here I'm using camel notation. So the first letter of the first word should be lowercase, and the first letter of every word after should be uppercase. This is what we call camel notation, which is the convention we use in JavaScript to name our variables. Another thing you need to know about these variable names is that they are case sensitive. So if I declare another variable, call it first name, but make the F uppercase, these two variables are different. But as I told you before, if you stick to camel notation, you wouldn't end up with a variable name like this. And finally, the last thing you need to know about these variables is that if you want to declare multiple variables, there are two ways to do this. You can declare them on one line and separate them using a comma. So first name and then last name. Now in this case, I have not initialized either of these variables. They're both undefined. I can optionally initialize one or both of them. So I can set this to Mosh, and I can leave last name undefined or set it to my last name, Hamedani. But the modern best practice is to declare each variable on a single line. So we terminate this first declaration with a semicolon and declare the second variable on a new line. That's the modern best practice. Next, we're going to look at constants.